For 2 long years, the battlefield did not move. Men ran forward. Shells fell by the thousands. Entire hills vanished into smoke. And yet, the front lines stayed exactly where they were. Generals called it necessary sacrifice. Soldiers whispered a different word: futility. No man's land became a graveyard that no one could cross, not because courage was lacking, but because something deeper was broken. What no one admitted yet was that the problem was not the men, it was the way the war was being fought. By 1915, artillery ruled the battlefield. Every major attack began the same way. Days of bombardment, endless thunder, the earth shaking until it felt hollow. British and French guns fired from miles away, pulverizing the enemy trenches, or so they believed. Maps showed destruction, reports claimed success. But when the shelling stopped and the whistles blew, the infantry climbed out of their trenches and walked into a nightmare that never seemed to change. Machine guns survived. Barbed wire remained tangled and deadly. German defenders emerged from deep shelters, shaken but alive. The battlefield absorbed punishment and gave nothing back. To the generals, the answer seemed obvious: more shells, bigger guns, longer bombardments. Distance meant safety. Distance meant control. Artillery was something that happened before the attack, never during it. French generals believed deeply in this logic. Firepower to them was about overwhelming force, delivered in advance. Once the guns finished their work, the infantry would move in and claim the ground. It was clean. It was ordered. It felt professional. Walking soldiers behind falling shells seemed reckless, even barbaric. Friendly fire was a greater fear than enemy resistance. And so, when British officers quietly suggested a different idea, the response was polite but firm. Artillery should lead. Infantry should follow later. That was how modern war was supposed to work. But some British officers were no longer convinced. They noticed something unsettling. The longer the bombardment lasted, the more prepared the enemy became. Shelling was not a surprise, it was a warning. German soldiers learned to read artillery patterns like a language. They knew when to hide, they knew when the fire would lift, and they knew exactly when the infantry would come. The battlefield had become predictable, deadly, but predictable. Quiet conversations began behind the lines. What if the guns were not meant to clear the way, but to protect the men as they moved? What if fire did not stop, but walked forward? The idea sounded dangerous. Walking soldiers behind falling shells meant trusting timing over instinct. It meant believing that discipline could defeat chaos. To many, it felt like madness. But the British did not abandon the idea. They practiced it, measured it, refined it, and soon they would test it, not in theory, but on the most unforgiving ground in Europe. Because if the battlefield refused to move, they would force it to. The idea sounded simple, almost childish. Let the shells fall and move with them. To many senior officers, this was not innovation, it was suicide. Artillery was meant to finish its work before men advanced, not hover above their heads like a moving storm. One mistake in timing, one misread signal, and the guns would kill their own soldiers. For generals trained to value distance and control, this idea felt unforgivable. The British called it the creeping barrage. Instead of firing everything at once, artillery would fire in a narrow line, then slowly move forward, step by step, not rushing, not stopping, just crawling across the battlefield at the speed of walking men. The purpose was not destruction alone, it was suppression. Enemy heads kept down, machine gunners trapped in shelters, defenders unable to rise in time. Behind that moving wall of fire, British infantry would follow, close enough to survive, but far enough to avoid the blast. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it terrified everyone. French generals listened, they nodded, and then they dismissed it. They had seen what friendly fire could do. They knew how fragile communication was. Broken wires, lost runners, confused orders. Trusting hundreds of guns to move in perfect time with thousands of men felt like gambling lives on a clock. French doctrine valued certainty. Finish the bombardment, confirm destruction, then advance. Anything else felt reckless. So the idea stalled, not because it lacked logic, but because it demanded trust. The British, however, had reached a breaking point. Every failed attack looked the same. Every casualty list grew longer. They began experimenting quietly. Shorter barrages, timed lifts, carefully measured advances. Officers stood with stopwatches. Gunners practiced firing by the minute. Infantry learned to count explosions instead of watching the sky. Mistakes happened. Some units advanced too fast, others too slow. But something new appeared. When the timing worked, the enemy stayed down. For the first time, no man's land felt less hostile, less alive. The theory was promising, the risks were enormous, and the next step would remove all doubt, because soon the creeping barrage would no longer be a test, it would be an order, and thousands of men would have to walk behind their own guns. The most terrifying sound in war is not enemy fire, it's your own artillery getting closer. With a creeping barrage, soldiers were trained to do the unthinkable, advance toward the explosions, not run, not charge, walk. Training began far from the front. Men learned timing before courage. They memorized distances, how far the barrage moved each minute. They learned that stopping meant death. Fall behind the barrage and enemy machine guns would rise. Walk too fast and friendly shells would claim you. Survival depended on rhythm, not bravery, not strength, just timing. Some soldiers never stopped shaking. Others focused on counting blasts like a metronome. Boom, pows, step, boom, pows, step. Fear became routine. This new method changed relationships. Infantry no longer feared only the enemy. They feared mistakes, a miscalculated map, a mistimed signal, a watch running slow. Artillery crews felt the weight as well. They were no longer distant support. They were walking alongside the men, even if separated by miles. Every shell mattered now. For the first time, artillery and infantry were bound by the same clock. The first real uses were imperfect. Some barrages moved unevenly. Some units lost their timing. Men died, not in heroic charges, but in quiet miscalculations. And yet, something undeniable happened. German defenders stayed underground longer. Wire was crossed more often. Positions fell that had resisted months of bombardment. The battlefield responded, not violently, but gradually. The creeping barrage was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a weapon, a tool, a rhythm that could win battles without throwing bodies recklessly into the line. Soon, it would be unleashed on a scale no one had seen before, and when it happened, no man's land would no longer be still. The day arrived. The barrage did not stop. It did not thunder in random fury. It crawled, step by step, and men followed it. For the first time, the battlefield seemed alive, but in a strange, controlled way. The earth shook beneath their feet, but the danger felt strangely measured. German defenders had never seen anything like it. They expected chaos. They got rhythm. At 5 a.m., the first shells began to fall. Gunners counted each minute. Infantry watched the sky and the smoke. Step, step, step. Each step forward was choreographed. Every man knew his place. Every gun knew its line. The creeping barrage moved like a slow river of fire, advancing at the speed of walking men. Barbed wire snapped. Machine guns stayed silent. German defenders crouched in dugouts, unable to rise in time. It was not dramatic in the way war is usually described. It was precise, predictable, terrifying. The infantry moved behind it, protected but exposed. Each man had to trust not only the barrage, but the timing, the maps, the signals, the men next to him, and the men behind him. Mistakes could be fatal, yet discipline held.
For the first time, the front lines advanced without the usual slaughter. German defenders were stunned. They anticipated artillery before attacks, but never during, never following, never synchronized with infantry. They expected noise and panic. They got precision. When the British reached the enemy trenches, they found defenders pinned, confused, unable to react. A trench that had been impregnable for months was now open, not because of raw power, but because of rhythm and trust. The battlefield had learned a new language, and armies had no choice but to listen. British officers watching from the rear were tense. Some could hardly breathe. They had planned every second, yet humans and machines are never perfect. Yet as the men climbed over the wire, as the shells fell just ahead, a quiet understanding spread among the commanders. This worked. The creeping barrage was not just an idea anymore. It was a weapon, a tool,